Before the flood, before the towers, before the first kings carved their names into stone, something walked the earth that should never have existed. They were not merely giants. They were a breach, a rebellion with flesh and bone, born from a forbidden union feared by men, remembered in fragments, and buried beneath the judgment of God. The Bible gives us the warning. Ancient tradition gives us the shadows. And between them stands a terrifying possibility that the Nephilim were not myth, but the scar left behind when heaven's order was violated. This is not just a story of ancient violence. It is the story of beauty twisted into corruption power without mercy, and a world so defiled that only a flood could silence its scream. Tonight we descend into that lost age where angels crossed the boundary, giants rose from the earth, and history itself began to drown. And it begins on a mountain called Hermon. It was not raised with hammers, no chisel struck it, no foundation was sunk into the earth. And yet what began on Mount Hermon may have been the most catastrophic construction in the history of creation, because some structures are built not with stone, but with consent. Hermon stood like a throne at the edge of the known world, its heights cold, severe, and set apart. In the ancient imagination, mountains were never merely landscapes. They were meeting places between realms, the places where heaven seemed near enough to touch, and where what descended from above could alter everything below. It is no accident that the memory of rebellion gathers here. A high place was fitting for a decision that would drag heaven's order down into the dust of men. There, according to ancient Jewish tradition preserved in 1st Enoch, 200 watchers assembled under the leadership of Samyaza. They were not ignorant beings. They understood rank, consequence, holiness, and boundary. That is what makes the moment so terrifying. This was not rebellion born of confusion. It was rebellion born of desire. They saw the daughters of men. They were drawn to beauty that was never given to them. And in that attraction, longing became intention, and intention hardened into revolt. But before they touched the earth, they paused. That hesitation matters. It reveals that even now, standing at the edge of transgression, they knew the cost. To cross this line was not a mistake to be regretted later. It was a severing, an irreversible surrender of order. For one brief and trembling moment, the story could still have ended differently. Heaven had not yet been violated. Humanity had not yet been drawn into this corruption. The future still stood unopened. Then Samyaza spoke. Ancient tradition presents him not as a mindless monster, but as a leader who feared that others would shrink back, leaving him alone to bear the weight of the deed. And so he did something that would echo through all history. He turned private desire into collective commitment. He proposed an oath, not a thought, not an impulse, a vow. They would bind themselves together under a curse, swearing that none would turn away until they had done this thing. And with that, rebellion took form. This was the first construction of the fallen world agreement against divine order. Before the giants, before the blood, before the cities of violence, there was alignment. Wills joined together. A covenant in reverse. In Scripture, covenant is meant to bind creation to truth, to faithfulness, to life under God. Here on Hermon, covenant was twisted into its opposite. It became the architecture of defiance. That is why this moment is more than a prelude. It is the blueprint of corruption itself. Evil rarely begins at full size. It begins when many hearts decide that crossing the line together will make the crossing easier. What they built on Hermon was invisible, but it was stronger than bronze and more dangerous than any tower. It was shared consent to disorder. And once that structure stood, all others would follow naturally forbidden unions. Violent offspring, corrupted knowledge, and a civilization accelerated toward judgment. Even the name of the mountain seems to carry the memory. Hermon is associated with the idea of a ban and oath, a thing devoted under solemn declaration. Whether history remembers it through language, legend, or theological memory, the symbolism is chilling. The mountain itself becomes a witness. Creation hears the words. The heights receive the vow. And the world, though it does not yet know, it has already begun to change. Because the most dangerous thing on that mountain was not what descended. It was what was decided. And once the oath was spoken, Heaven's boundary was no longer merely threatened. It was breached in the heart before it was breached in the flesh. What came down from Hermon would not just change human history, it would deform it. And in next part, the Watchers descend, bringing gifts that looked like wisdom but carried the seed of ruin. They descended, not with the noise of an invading army, not with banners, not with the language of conquest. Their arrival was more dangerous than that. It came clothed in brilliance and mystery, in the seduction of usefulness. They did not first take the world by force, they took it by instruction. This is what makes the story so unsettling. The Watchers did not appear to humanity as destroyers in the beginning. They appeared as benefactors, as revealers, as those who could unlock what had been hidden. And to a young human world still close to the first generations after Eden, such knowledge must have felt like light breaking open the horizon. Ancient tradition preserves the memory with startling specificity. In 1st Enoch, the Watchers are associated with the teaching of metalworking, the fashioning of weapons, the cutting of roots, the reading of heavenly signs, the workings of enchantments, the knowledge of ornaments, cosmetics, and the arts of seduction. These are not random details. They form a pattern. What was given was not merely information, it was power. Power over matter, power over perception, power over other human beings. Knowledge itself became architecture. Not walls, but systems. Not towers, but frameworks. Invisible constructions of influence began to rise in the human mind long before they rose in stone. Humanity learned how to shape metal, and soon metal shaped human history. Humanity learned how to read the heavens, and soon the heavens were no longer signs of God's glory, but tools for manipulation, omens for control, instruments for fear. What entered the world looked like wisdom, but it was wisdom severed from obedience. And wisdom severed from obedience does not remain wisdom for long. The book of Genesis is brief, almost restrained when it speaks of the earth becoming corrupt and filled with violence. But texts like Enoch pull back the curtain and show how corruption can spread so quickly. Civilization was not simply maturing, it was accelerating. The human race did not slowly grow into its strength. It was pushed forward before its soul was ready. That is why this part matters far beyond ancient memory. The tragedy was not that humanity learned. The tragedy was that humanity learned too much too fast from the wrong masters. Cities began to rise more quickly. Craft became prestige. Prestige became hierarchy. Hierarchy became domination. Men who once tilled the ground now forged instruments that could split flesh. Beauty once received as gift became calculated display. The heavens once contemplated with wonder became a coded map for secret advantage. The world was becoming organized, sharpened, intensified. But beneath the brilliance, something holy was draining out of it. And for the first time, mankind was no longer content merely to live within creation. It began reaching for mastery over it. There is a quiet terror in that shift, because the moment knowledge becomes a ladder for self-exaltation, the soul begins building its own ruin. What the Watchers handed down did not merely improve human life, it reconfigured human desire. It taught fallen hearts how to scale their rebellion. If you feel something stirring in this story, remain there a moment longer. Not every revelation comes to make us comfortable. Some come to expose how easily power can disguise itself as progress. Share what unsettles you most, not as spectators of an old legend, but as witnesses standing before a mirror. Because the deeper this story goes, the more it begins to look uncomfortably familiar. And what came next was no longer hidden in tools or teachings. The corruption that began in secret would soon take on flesh. The forbidden union bears its monstrous fruit, and the Nephilim rise upon the earth. Then came the Nephilim, not as rumor, not as metaphor, not as the exaggerated memory of fearful men. They entered the world as the visible proof that the boundary had truly been broken. If chapter 1 was the vow and chapter 2 was the transmission of forbidden knowledge, chapter 3 is the moment corruption takes on weight, height, appetite, and presence. Genesis speaks with terrible restraint. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. It is one of the most chilling sentences in Scripture precisely because it says so little. It does not explain them away. It does not soften their arrival. It simply places them there like a scar in the text and moves on. But ancient Jewish tradition lingers over the wound. These were not merely strong men. They were the offspring of rebellion beings born from a union never ordained by God, embodying a mixture creation was never meant to carry. And that is why they were more than giants. They were living monuments of disorder. Their size mattered, yes. Their strength mattered. Their terror mattered. But the deepest horror was theological. In the biblical world, boundaries are sacred. Light and darkness, sea and land, heaven and earth, human and divine. Creation flourishes when those limits are honored because order is not a prison in Scripture, it is a gift. The Nephilim represented the violation of that gift. They were not simply larger humans. They were the physical signature of a world being rewritten against its maker's design. What if the Nephilim were not merely the consequence of transgression, but its embodiment, not just beings, but statements, not just offspring, but declarations, power without submission, glory without holiness, presence without rightful place. They did not need to invent domination. Their very existence announced it. Under their shadow, the world changed again. The knowledge taught by the Watchers no longer remained in the realm of skill and craft. It now found its champions. The strong became rulers. The feared became worshipped. Men have always admired greatness, even when greatness is corrupted. That is one of history's oldest weaknesses. And so the Nephilim did not merely terrify the human world. In many traditions, they captivated it. The extraordinary drew reverence. Size became authority. Violence became prestige. Then the constructions rose. Massive forms. Monumental spaces. Cities shaped not merely for shelter, but for display. Structures that signaled hierarchy, awe, and command. We cannot map every detail with certainty, and truth demands that we admit that. But the theological pattern is clear. Once power loses its reverence for God, it begins expressing itself in scale. It builds upward, outward, and beyond need, not to serve life, but to magnify control. Why does a corrupted civilization build so large? Because size can preach a false gospel. A monument tells the weak that the powerful are permanent. A city of vast stone tells the ordinary that they live beneath something greater than themselves. A giant standing beside a structure built beyond human necessity sends one message: submit. This is why the Nephilim are so important to the biblical imagination. They are not random monsters dropped into the story for spectacle. They are signs that creation itself has entered crisis. In them, rebellion becomes visible. In them, forbidden knowledge gains a body. In them, the dream of self-exalting power reaches its most blasphemous form, a world where the distorted appears glorious. And yet beneath that spectacle was a fatal instability, because anything built against the grain of God's order carries judgment within itself like a hidden fracture. The higher it rises, the more terrible the fall will be. By now, the earth was no longer merely wounded. It was becoming unrecognizable. And in next part, what began with beauty and knowledge will ripen into violence so great that even the ground itself seems ready to cry out for judgment. Violence spread, but not like wildfire, not wild, not chaotic, not accidental. It spread with pattern, with structure, with terrible efficiency. What had begun on Hermon as a vow and deepened through forbidden knowledge and taken flesh in the Nephilim now matured into something even more frightening, a civilization where evil no longer needed to hide. Genesis says the earth was filled with violence. It is a short sentence, but it feels heavy enough to crush the world beneath it. And when we slow down and listen to it closely, we begin to understand that this was not merely a season of cruel men doing cruel things. This was corruption embedded into the order of life itself. Evil had become cultural. It had become habitual. It had become normal. That is the true horror of the antediluvian world. Not simply that people sinned, but that sin had become architecture. Cities did not merely grow, they concentrated power. Skill no longer served stewardship, it served domination. Ritual no longer drew human hearts upward toward the Creator. It bent them downward into fear, manipulation, and spectacle. The same hands that could shape metal for tools now shaped it for war. The same minds that could observe the stars with wonder now turned celestial patterns into systems of control. What should have inspired worship was converted into leverage, and under the shadow of the Nephilim, that pattern intensified. Greatness without righteousness always demands a stage. The mighty needed visible symbols of their supremacy, so strength turned itself into institutions, violence became policy, prestige became law. And somewhere in that dark expansion, people stopped asking whether a thing was good and began asking only whether it was strong. That is how a world dies before it is buried. There is a quiet tragedy here that should not be missed. Corruption does not first destroy beauty, it captures it. It borrows the language of order, power, artistry, and wisdom, and then empties them of holiness. That is why the world before the flood could still look impressive, still appear advanced, still carry the shimmer of civilization. But beneath that shimmer was decay. Beneath the splendor was blood. Beneath the order was rebellion. And once corruption becomes stable, it becomes difficult to see. That may be the most chilling thought in this part. When violence is occasional, it shocks the conscience. But when violence becomes structural, it begins to feel natural. When pride is enthroned long enough, people stop calling it pride and start calling it leadership. When exploitation is woven into daily life, it no longer feels monstrous. It feels inevitable. That is what the pre-flood world became, a total environment where disorder had learned to masquerade as reality. If you have ever sensed that ancient stories are not merely about the past, then remain here for a moment. Let the weight of this settle. Leave your thoughts, your questions, even your unease, because this is no longer just the memory of a ruined age. It is a mirror held up to every civilization that mistakes power for legitimacy and scale for truth. And yet in that darkened world, one man still walked differently. While the earth adjusted itself to corruption, one voice remained capable of hearing heaven. Enoch appears not as a conqueror, but as a witness, and through him the silence above the ruined world finally begins to speak. In the middle of that world, one man remained different, not louder than the violent, not greater in stature than the giants, not enthroned, not armed, not celebrated by the machinery of a corrupted age. And yet in the sight of heaven, he stood higher than them all. His name was Enoch. Scripture says only a few words that have echoed for centuries, Enoch walked with God. In a world racing toward ruin, that sentence feels almost impossible. While others aligned themselves with power, Enoch aligned himself with presence. While the earth filled with violence, he kept company with holiness. He did not build monuments. He did not found empires. He became something rarer, a man whose life itself was still in order. And because of that, he was shown what the world had forgotten. Ancient Jewish tradition expands the mystery with awe. Enoch is taken into visions drawn upward beyond the disorder of men, guided through the hidden places of creation. There he sees what earth no longer reflects, the architecture of heaven. Not chaos, not appetite, not domination, but structure without corruption. Fire without destruction, thrones, chambers, storehouses of the winds, courses of the stars, boundaries held in wisdom, everything in its place, everything answering to the will of God. Below him, the world had become a parody of order. Cities stood, but truth had collapsed. Power flourished, but justice had withered. Above him, Enoch beheld what real order looked like: precision, without cruelty; authority, without tyranny; glory, without pride. Heaven had not changed. Earth had. And then came the message. It was not negotiation, not reform, not a second attempt to polish what rebellion had already poisoned. The decree of heaven was final. Everything built on revolt would be dismantled. The Watchers would not return to their former place. The Nephilim would not inherit the earth they had terrorized. The system of corruption would not be adjusted. It would be judged. This is the terrifying reversal at the center of the flood narrative. We often speak of the flood as if it were simply destruction, a violent ending to a violent world. But the deeper theological truth is sharper than that. The flood was demolition. It was the tearing down of a civilization that had made peace with distortion. It was divine unbuilding. That is why Enoch matters so much. He stands at the hinge of the story as witness, not warrior. He sees both worlds, the corrupted order of earth and the incorruptible order of heaven. And because he has seen both, he can speak with unbearable clarity. The problem is no longer hidden. The sentence is no longer delayed. What began on Hermon has now been answered from the throne of God. Even the Watchers, according to the tradition, become desperate at this stage. They seek Enoch out. They know judgment is coming. The ones who once descended in pride now tremble before the verdict they cannot escape. They ask him to intercede, to carry a petition on their behalf. But heaven's answer is severe. They abandoned their station. They corrupted what was entrusted to them. The boundary they broke will not be restored on their terms. And so Enoch returns not with comfort but with warning. That warning falls like a shadow over the whole earth. The giants still stand. The cities still glitter. The systems of power still appear strong. But from this moment on, everything is living on borrowed time. Heaven has spoken, and the sentence is already moving toward history. What Enoch saw above would soon break into the world below. And in next part, judgment no longer remains a decree in heaven. It descends into the earth, and the demolition of the ancient world begins. And then in the shadow of a doomed world, another construction appeared. Not the towering monuments of pride, not the vast works of corrupted strength, not the architecture of domination that had risen under the shadow of the Watchers and their offspring. This one was different from the first line drawn in its wood. Quiet, uncelebrated, almost absurd in the eyes of the age that surrounded it. The Ark of Noah. Scripture does not present Noah as a warrior, a king, or a philosopher. He is introduced with a different kind of greatness. He was righteous in his generation, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. In a world where nearly every structure had been bent toward violence, Noah himself had become a remnant of right order. And so the final construction of that age was entrusted not to the strongest man, but to the faithful one. The ancient world glorified scale, spectacle, and force. But when God moved to preserve life, he chose a vessel that represented obedience. The ark was not built to impress the world. It was built to outlast its judgment. Genesis gives its dimensions with striking care, as if to remind us that this was no mythic symbol floating free from history, but a commanded structure shaped by divine precision. Gopher wood. Rooms within, covered inside and out with pitch. Measured length, breadth, and height. A door in its side. A window above. The details matter because in the biblical imagination, salvation is not chaos. It has form, it has order, it has design. While the old world built upward in arrogance, the ark was built forward in trust. And all around Noah, the age continued in blindness. The words of Jesus in the Gospels look back on those days with haunting simplicity. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. Judgment did not arrive when the world felt most afraid. It arrived when the world felt most secure. Then the hour came. The fountains of the great deep burst forth. The windows of heaven were opened. The language is cosmic because the event is cosmic. This is not mere weather. It is decreation. The ordered world, long defiled by rebellion, begins to come apart under the hand of the one who first separated waters from waters. The cities vanish. The monuments disappear. The giants fall silent. Whatever had looked immovable is swallowed without ceremony. Every false construction is reduced to memory. But one structure remains, not because wood is stronger than stone, not because Noah was stronger than giants, but because what is aligned with God can survive what pride cannot. The ark rises as the world sinks. It floats above the violence, above the ruins, above the final scream of a civilization that mistook power for permanence. And then after the long silence of water and waiting, the earth begins to breathe again. The ark rests upon Ararat. A raven goes out, then a dove, then the olive leaf. And in that small green sign, the whole story turns. Judgment was real, but it was not the final word. Noah builds not a throne, but an altar. And over that cleansed world, the bow appears in the clouds, not as a weapon released, but as a covenant given. So the last construction before the new beginning was not a monument to human greatness. It was a vessel of mercy, and that is how the world of the Nephilim ended, not with the triumph of giants, but with the endurance of obedience. And so the story does not end with the water, but with a question. What are we building with our lives? Because the world before the flood was not destroyed. In a moment it was shaped choice by choice until corruption felt normal. And Noah did not survive because he was powerful, but because he remained aligned with what was true when everything else drifted. For those who have lived long enough to see the world change, this is the deeper wisdom. Legacy is not what we build around us, but what we preserve within us. Faith, integrity, quiet obedience, these outlast every empire. And when the storms come, they always do. It is not greatness that carries you through. It is alignment. So what were the greatest constructions in the Bible? Not merely towers or cities, but covenants, knowledge, and entire worlds, built corrupted and erased. A civilization rose beyond its limits, and in the end, only what was aligned with God endured. And now the story leaves the page and turns toward us. If this journey stirred something in you, stay with it. Like the video, share it with someone who still seeks truth beneath the surface, and subscribe to walk deeper into these hidden histories. Tell me what you see, what you question, what you believe, because the next story is already waiting, and it may not be buried as deeply as we think.